Indig from the Sport Law and Strategy Group to talk to us about Swim Ontario Insurance. We also have Brian Ward, a member of Swim Ontario staff, on hand to answer questions. A few small housekeeping rules to start with. Type your questions into the chat. Please keep your cameras and microphones off, muted, so that we don't have any background noise. The presentation is being recorded and will be posted along with written answers to the questions we have received in advance and the questions that we will address during the webinar today. Without any further ado, I'd like to ask Dean Bowles, our CEO, to give our welcome message and say a few words.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks everyone for making the time tonight. I know you're probably in the middle of trying to get your clubs organized and looking forward to your the relaunch or the restart, whenever that may be. I know it's been a very, very tough and challenging time for all of you, and most pointedly to your swimmers. Thank you, Darren and Brian, for all your work to make sure our organization stays in a good place and intact. And welcome, Steve. Thank you very much. You've been a great friend to swimming and have helped us definitely through a lot of our unknowns during this pandemic. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll turn it over to Steve now, I guess.
Thanks, Dean. As my former coach, I feel like I had no choice but to be here, or you'd make me do multiple push-ups. So thank you again for having me. For those of you who aren't familiar with myself, my name's Steve Indig. I'm a lawyer with the Sport Law and Strategy Group. I was actually as well a competitive swimmer for close to 20 years and coached for 13 and still involved in the sport on an amateur basis, of course, and as a consultant as well. As Dean said, it's been a really crazy time the last 18 months, and I know for me personally, it's been relatively quite challenging the last couple of weeks, where it's starting to get nice outside, yet we still are to remain at home. But I will digress on the political landscape of where we are on a return to COVID plan environment. As Darren had said, if anything comes up with respect to questions, please post them in the chat box and we'll get to them as soon as we can. And for those of you who have never been to my company's website, it's sportlaw.ca. There are over 400 articles that are free and accessible on just about every topic in sport, including transgender athletes, insurance, risk management, governance, and of course, a lot of COVID-related articles as well. So please take advantage of those resources as you see fit. So Darren, I don't know if anyone wants to speak to this page, but basically we'd like to thank and recognize the friends and partners of Swim Ontario, which you see before you. And I will get right into it. I think a lot of queries around insurance are always about, am I covered? Am I covered? Am I covered? And sometimes I have what I call a love-hate relationship with insurance brokers, where I think they're great people, and sometimes I think they answer questions that are proposed to them a little bit too bluntly. Usually they say yes, and the answer to "am I covered" is maybe, and that maybe is really based on the three questions that you see before you. Who is covered, what is covered, and when is there coverage? And we have to be able to comply with the guidelines of the insurance policy to have coverage. So first and foremost, who is covered? It is the organization and their registrants, swimmers, coaches, officials, referees, directors, officers, staff, and volunteers. But one of the caveats to it is we must know who these people are. And in order to do that, of course, the easiest methodology of knowing who our registrants are is through registration. So it's very important that we have documentation to suggest who is covered and who are our registrant, who are our members. I'll share a couple stories as we go through the presentation, but maybe I'll wait till I get through these 3 points. Now, what is covered? Sanctioned activities that include practices, dry land training, competition. There will also be what we like to call those are pre-sanctioned activities. You don't have to apply to Swim Ontario to get a sanction to run a practice or dry land training or but maybe a competition depending on the level of competition. But there are certain activities which would be not part of what we would call the day-to-day activity of a swim club, such as travel, particularly outside of Canada, training camps abroad, fundraisers, or year-end parties. You need to communicate with Swim Ontario to figure out what is covered, and if it's not, ensure there's clarity. And when we tie that all together, when is there coverage? It applies to registrants during sanctioned activities supervised by a registered coach. So one of the great examples could be your dry land training might be subcontracted to a personal trainer or a personal training company. Those individuals are not registered coaches with Swim Ontario. Therefore, it's very possible that insurance may not apply, even though it does involve the sanctioned activity with registered participants, but it's not supervised by a registered coach. When people come in as independent organizations or independent contractors, one of the risks of doing so is they're operating their own business, meaning they also must have their own insurance policy. And when you bring in third parties like your dry land trainers, it may be of value to ask for a certificate of insurance to prove that they have insurance, as well as to include the club as an additional insured. So there should be any liability, it would fall under that person's insurance. And I want to address what I'll call a misconception about, are we covered? When we say, are we covered? It's not for the injured party. It's not for the child who slipped and fell on the pool deck and broke an ankle or anything a little bit more serious. The coverage is for the club and the defendants in a litigation claim. If there's a requirement to ascertain legal representation or to pay damages on a claim, that's where the insurance policy kicks in. When we say, is there coverage, what we're really looking for is a pot of money to suggest that the injured party has the ability to be compensated. So God forbid we have a paraplegic athlete who needs a lifetime supply of physical education as well as healthcare and maybe even physical alterations to their home. We need money to do that. And sometimes we sue not because of vengeance, but of necessity. And that insurance policy, that's what that does. That insurance policy provides a mechanism for injured parties to be able to make a little bit more whole on a financial perspective. So you can see again, if you summarize the slide that we're looking for, coverage exists for registered participants in a sanctioned activity that's properly supervised by a registered coach. Just a couple years ago, I had a client, a soccer client, call one another and say, hey, come on Sunday, let's play a game. And we'll, there's not much going on and we'll just have a practice game, exhibition game. And a young woman was kicked in the face and lost her tooth. And that the good news is that was the harm that she sustained. The bad news is she went to make a claim for insurance to have the tooth put back in. And the first question that came out of the insurance company was this a sanctioned activity? And the answer from the provincial sport body was, no, it's not. We had no knowledge that these two clubs were going to be involved in an exhibition competition on Sunday. And that poor athlete ended up having to pay for her own dental work because they did not check the 3 boxes. They didn't involve registered participants in a sanctioned activity with proper supervision of a registered coach. And if I can say check, check, check to those 3 questions, it's likely there will be coverage, and again, for the club or for the defendant in a litigation claim. Now, as we talk about insurance in a return to play environment during COVID, right now, most of you would likely be very aware that insurance companies about a year ago started waiving and providing little to no, well, no insurance with respect to a COVID-related claim. And then about 6 months ago, the Ontario government followed suit as to what happened in BC and passed legislation called Supporting Ontario's Recovery Act, which protects people and organizations from liability with respect to a claim relating to being infected or exposed to COVID-19. I wrote down COVID-10. Oh, apologize, COVID-19 on or after March 17, 2020, as a result of indirect or direct result of an act or omission of a person at the relevant time. Now, of course, it comes with a caveat. You will be precluded from being sued in this type of tort claim, this type of litigation claim, if you made good faith efforts to comply with public health regulations, federal, provincial, and municipal, and you did not act, or your actions did not constitute gross negligence. So you might have remembered we had done a previous presentation, it probably was 6 months ago, it seems like one, where we spoke about duty of care and standard of care and returning to sport in a COVID environment. And really the catalyst that we were trying to explain to everybody was, do everything you can to create a safe environment and tell your story. We followed provincial public health guidelines. We had washing and sanitization protocols in place. We had risk management strategies to make sure that all the swimmers weren't coming on deck at the same time. We had people segregated in lanes to make sure there's social distancing. And when you start telling your story about COVID-related safety issues, that definitely creates that good faith effort to suggest you've done everything to create a safe environment. So that protection exists, but it doesn't preclude litigation. It doesn't stop somebody from walking down to the courthouse, paying the $80 and filing a claim. This is one area like standard of care that allows for a defense. And that's something that Swim Ontario has gone and purchased on behalf of the clubs with COVID insurance defense coverage. So as I said before, right now, your current general liability policy does not include COVID-related claims. So if a club was sued because a child or a coach or a volunteer got COVID within the organization, there wouldn't be any insurance coverage. The insurance company would say that's precluded from your general liability. You're on your own, which means you would be required to pay your own legal defense costs, as well as any possible damages, if any. Now, because Swim Ontario has attained an additional type of policy for COVID insurance defense coverage, what would happen in this type of claim is you call Swim Ontario, you let them know you've received this type of claim, and the insurance policy will kick in to provide legal defense costs. The insurance policy will pay for a lawyer to defend the action. Brian, did you want to add anything to the insurance defense coverage? I'm assuming there's a cap on it.
There is. It's $250,000 is the cap, cumulative, $50,000 a claim. And the intention of the insurance is, as Steve's described, to provide you with counsel, legal assistance in the event you receive a claim. And it's premised upon the fact that you've complied with Bill 218. So that you will be able to get the claim dismissed through the assistance of a lawyer, as part of a process. So the idea is that at a $50,000 limit for a single claim, that should be more than sufficient to cover off in law summary judgment motion that you would probably bring to have the claim dismissed. But it is, there are other elements, of course, that are part of that coverage, including the fact that there is a limit of $250,000. Hopefully Swim Ontario isn't facing 20 claims because there won't be enough money to go around. But I echo Steve's comments. You get a claim, call Darren, make sure he's made aware of the claim on behalf of Swim Ontario. He'll provide you with assistance through the broker and subsequently the adjuster to make sure that you receive the appropriate coverage. The other thing I'll tell you is this, is that Swimming Canada also has COVID insurance defense coverage that would apply potentially to Swim Ontario claims, but it's shared amongst 3 other provinces and Swimming Canada. So Swim Ontario thought it was best to provide their own standalone coverage, but there is some secondary coverage available through Swimming Canada.
Thanks, Brian. Just to reiterate on something I had spoke about last time we spoke about a return to play in a COVID environment, the likelihood of being sued on a COVID-related claim, I truly believe it's somewhat nominal. One is they'd have to prove that they actually caught COVID in the club setting, or that it was due to the gross negligence of the club that occurred. And I think that's an extremely high standard. They'd also have to have damages. The majority of people who get COVID, stay are required to stay at home for 2 weeks, may have flu-like symptoms, and the damages related to that kind of claim would be very nominal. As Brian said, what does scare me is the legal defense costs. And when we talk about hiring a lawyer at $300 to $500 or $700 an hour, you can see how that cost can grow very quickly. So this suggests that you have up to $50,000 to bring a summary judgment based on Bill 218 is really quite a great piece of coverage, and the best that's currently available in the market. I do have close contacts with the underwriters in sport, and right now this is really what they're selling as a risk mitigation factor for COVID related insurance coverage. So very good that's accessible to you. But again, I really think the likelihood of being sued on a COVID claim is low. The other area which we spoke about again before was about contingency fees. Most personal injury lawyers work on a contingency fee, meaning they would take a percentage of the winnings. If the winnings are low or the likelihood of success is low, most lawyers won't take that type of case on. So just again to reiterate, very good that this coverage exists. Very unlikely, in my opinion, that you will get a COVID-related claim. What are we responsible to do? What are the directors and all officers are obligated to do? What you see in the 2 first bullet points is actually taken from the Ontario Corporations Act, which is the legislation that governs not-for-profit corporations in Ontario, and it requires directors to act honestly in good faith with the best interests of the corporation and to exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. And the way we interpret that is to suggest that you as directors and officers would ensure that your athletes and coaches are returning to a safe, reasonable environment. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's not possible that people wouldn't get COVID in a return to play setting. Obviously, it's a pandemic, and there's a reason it's a pandemic, because no one really quite understands how it's spread and how do we prevent it from being spread. Yes, there's recommendations on social distancing and mask wearing and cleaning, but you can still see it's quite predominant in the world today. So I'm not saying we expect perfection from a club whose responsibility starts with the board, but we do again have to tell our reasonable story of how we are creating a safe environment for our clubs, for our kids to return back to swimming in a safe environment. So that obligation starts with the board and can be vetted down to coaches and volunteers. I'm not suggesting that the officers and directors have to be at every practice to make sure kids are 6 feet apart. What I'm suggesting is you do have some responsibility to, again, make sure those practices are put in place. Of course, we do have directors and officers liability insurance on top of your general liability, on top of your COVID-related legal defense costs. And this coverage helps you with respect to decisions that are being made within the organization by decision makers. Usually we call it directors and officers, but it does extend down to employees and registered volunteers who do make decisions on behalf of the organization. So that policy exists for defense costs, damages of wrongful acts, which of course aren't excluded by policy. And usually where we see the directors and officers liability insurance kick in is on human rights complaints, or a wrongful dismissal claim with respect to employment. Those are usually the two hot topics that we would see at a national level or provincial level. It may be on selection, or other sorts of carding type decisions. But mostly at the club level, I would see that kick in on a human rights claim or an argument of a discriminatory practice. So again, want to let you know that that coverage exists, but we do expect and hope the directors and officers will create an environment that is safe to return to in a COVID environment. So what do you do if you get a claim? What do you do if you get a lawyer's letter? What do you do if you get served with a statement of claim? Immediately, don't hesitate. Contact Swim Ontario upon receipt of a threat to litigate. Insurers want to be put on notice. And you also have to understand, when you do get sued, you have 20 days to file a defense. So in my experience, when a claim comes in, we notify the insurer. I've seen them take weeks to assess the claim, decide if it's covered under insurance, then find the lawyer to try and file a defense within 5 days can be very, very challenging depending on the intricacies of the complaint or of the claim. So by notifying Swim Ontario right away to at least get that ball rolling on the assessment of the complaint, don't hesitate. It's also super important that Swim Ontario be aware of claims to also ensure that we can educate other clubs on what's happening in our marketplace. If we're aware of something and we can prevent it or educate people on different practices, we'd like to be able to do that. So fundamentally, please contact Darren at Swim Ontario if you have a threat, a claims letter or a statement of claim, let them know. If coverage is applicable, the insurer will appoint you a lawyer to defend the club. And of course, keep all records and files relating to the claim, as it will likely be required to provide some sort of defense for the organization. That's all I wanted to do, is present for about 20 minutes on some big high-level overview issues with respect to insurance. I know there were some questions that have come in advance, and I will pull those up. And
So Steve, just before
go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Brian.
Thing I wanted to mention. So, to be clear, a threat to litigate is not going to be exclusive to receiving a lawyer's letter. You may receive an email from a parent saying, we're going to sue you, club director or officer, for these hosts of things. That is a threat to litigate, and you should provide notice. It doesn't mean that a claim's being made. It doesn't mean that we're paying a deductible, but it is important for Swim Ontario to know, because at that point in time, broker and adjuster, or broker and insurer, are going to be notified of a potential claim. And to Steve's point, I'll add this. It's not just about the gap in time and getting access to a lawyer or having a decision made about your claim. It's also about being denied the right to coverage because of your failure to notify in a timely fashion that a claim's being made. So, just to emphasize what Steve's saying, it's truly any threat to litigate. It's when you get that email saying they're going to sue you for this. You may suspect they're never going to do it. Swim Ontario may suspect they're never going to do it. However, it's important that there is a paper trail to the broker and insurer relative to that potential claim.
Yeah, just to support, Brian, what you're saying, I agree. I mean, if you err on the side of caution, if we notify Swim Ontario and nothing comes out of it, great. But we'd rather have that happen than the insurer try and find an excuse as to why they can't provide coverage because of timeline issues. So really a big advocate for that as well. So we do have a couple questions, and one has come in the chat box. Yeah,
before we get to the questions, Dean wanted to say one more thing.
Yeah, I was given one job and I messed it up. I just wanted to tell everybody that the registration fees for Swim Ontario and Swimming Canada will remain the same as they were last year. So that's the case there. And we plan to have the registration package ready to go early July as usual. And with a little bit of assurance from some in Canada that the registration process will be much more user-friendly and streamlined. That's what I tell you today. So thanks. Sorry for the interruption. Thanks, Darren.
Way to steal the thunder, Dean. You know, everybody was mind gripped on insurance, and now you've got good news that your fees are remaining consistent. Absolutely just teasing. Can I go to the questions now, Darren and Brian?
Yes,
is that
please.
okay? So a lot of the questions we've received in advance are very consistent, particularly with respect to vaccinations and the requirement of vaccinations. I'm going to try and address this at a very high level, and then maybe some people can write in the question box if they want more specific answers. It is right now currently illegal to mandate that an individual get a vaccine. There is no law to require vaccinations. People have the right to choose whether or not they get a vaccination. And we as employers, we have to comply with the human rights legislation, which would protect people from the decision or choice to be vaccinated or not. And in cases where people are arguing based on a particular ground under the Human Rights Code, we either have a duty to accommodate that individual, which may or may not be possible depending on the facts of the case. There are some decisions that have been rendered already with respect to mask wearing rather than vaccinations, but it all was based on what we would call a reasonableness. They all related to, a lot of the cases relate to people who worked in seniors' home, choosing they didn't want to wear a mask, and the courts were saying, well, it's reasonable in that scenario to require people to wear a mask. No decisions have been rendered to date with respect to, is it reasonable to mandate a vaccine? So we don't want to be blunt, the first people to test that, which means we're in a litigation claim. So we're going to keep our eye on the pulse to determine what's going to happen. When we talk about travel or we talk about other, government legislation or regulations, look, if the government of Canada comes out and talks about a vaccination passport, or if the United States say in order to get into the United States, you need a vaccination or a vaccination passport, that's a different conversation that we currently would have based on amendments to laws and rules and legislation. But under the current environment that we have to date, it would say it would be improper to mandate a vaccination request by a coach or by an athlete, but it is very possible that we would have the requirement to accommodate. And what I would say and recommend to everybody is that you deal with these on a case-by-case basis. If somebody comes to you with a query or a direction, please stop, think, reach out to Darren, reach out to Swim Ontario, and we will figure out the proper answer to provide you, rather than making a rash decision that leads us in front of a human rights tribunal. Brian, do you want to add anything to that? I know we had spoken.
Well, I think the only thing I would add is this: you're quite right to say at this juncture it would be improper to compel anybody to receive a vaccine as a condition of employment or participation. But the emphasis here is at this time. We're not sure what governmental orders are going to be in place. We're not sure what mandates are going to be in place by municipal facilities relative to pool usage, as an example. So we'll be informed by some of those decisions outside of Swim Ontario as to what you can or can't do. And certainly Swim Ontario will be updating the website and sending out emails to say, this is the present policy or procedure in place surrounding vaccines or the requirement to be vaccinated, at a particular locale or in a particular municipality, for all I know at this point in time, that the way things are shaking down between the various public health officials. So, Steve's absolutely correct to say that you can't mandate it. I just emphasize that this is such an ever-changing environment, contradictorily so. That's a question that needs to be asked all the time. So I reiterate what Steve said. I think get back to Darren at Swim Ontario and ask, this is what's happening. What are your thoughts? Because the advice tonight might be very different a week from now or 2 weeks from now in this COVID environment. Unlikely, I would say, but nonetheless might still be the case.
Just
I think
before
also,
we,
sorry,
go ahead, Darren.
I think also if there's a facility or municipality that's saying something different, by all means, make sure you communicate that to us, because that's really important that we have that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Darren, if there is a pool that says, you're mandated to be vaccinated before coming into their pool, again, we want to know that. And I think we can make an informed decision on how we communicate that to the particular club membership as well as the rest of Swim Ontario. Somebody asked, would it be appropriate to recommend that vaccines are encouraged but not mandatory? I would say I see no harm in that. I think it's something we suggest people do things all the time, so I see no harm in that. Is it? Go ahead, Ryan.
The only thing I would say relative to that is, would it be appropriate to recommend? I think the way that you want to put that to anybody is to say, governmental policy is recommending the use of vaccines. Here's what the governmental policy is. We're encouraging you to follow governmental policy and public health guidelines. I'm not sure that necessarily, as of today, you're not getting AstraZeneca as a first shot anymore in Ontario. So again, we see that sort of there's a changing philosophy when it comes to vaccines. So I think that would be the nuance I would put on that recommendation.
Thanks, Brian. Again, we'll stay on the vaccine topic a little longer. Is it reasonable, as most employers do, to ask staff to disclose vaccination status, emphasizing the goal of having information for safety protocols? Again, I think you have to be cautious here to ask personal health questions. They, again, are protected by human rights legislation, and to ask these questions, you need to have a bona fide reason to do so. I do recognize that we are in a pandemic and asking that question may seem reasonable. We still don't know the answer to that question based on what's coming out of the Human Rights Tribunal. So I would be very cautious to ask that kind of question in the current environment. As Brian said, it's changing daily, and that threshold may switch. Brian, you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think you have to have a bona fide reason for saying, I need to know what your vaccination status is or your medical status more properly. So that's kind of a risky assessment. There's nothing wrong if people choose to disclose their vaccination status to you voluntarily, but not at a request or a request point of view.
Agreed. What are club liabilities to the swimmer and their family? Does the liability change if the swimmer chooses not to get vaccinated? Again, these are really interesting questions, and really the nuances of litigation. Would we as a defense possibly blame the family for not getting vaccinated? Therefore, they've contributed to their negligence or to their own damage? Yeah, very possible we would make that claim. I don't think that it changes the way in which a club would operate in the current environment, but it's more of a defense litigation strategy if the family chooses not to get vaccinated. Do we anticipate the cost of insurance will increase enough that clubs should plan according to set their budgets for 2021-22? I think based on Dean's announcement, the answer is no, but maybe Darren, you want to add to that?
We anticipate that premiums are going to go up, but we have the benefit of waiting until December to get that news. So any premium increase will be absorbed by Swim Ontario for the upcoming swim season.
Okay, thanks, Darren. Any information that we can provide about travel for training camps for 2022-23? I would say, Darren, this one might fall on you as well.
I think Brian has better anecdotal information because he's dealing with NSOs all the time. But with the people that are renewing their insurance policies currently, we're getting a lot of information about travel insurance being very, very difficult to obtain. And if you do obtain it, it's very, very expensive. So I'll let Brian sort of expand on it.
Well, I mean, you've appropriately described it. I mean, what a number of NSOs are seeing as they're trying to travel right now for purposes of qualification for an Olympics is that either travel policies are not available to them anymore, or if they are, they're available on an extremely elevated premium basis or deductible basis. One of the ones that I saw a couple of weeks ago had a $15,000 deductible as part of the coverage, and almost worthless except in the most catastrophic of circumstances for someone to be purchasing that type of insurance for coverage for their athletes. So yeah, I go back to, it's hard to plan. It's extremely hard to plan for travel at this point in time because there's so many nuances associated with travel, including things like probably mandatory vaccination in some instances, and probably requirements for quarantine and health coverage when you're traveling there. So it's I'd say an impossible question to answer really at this point in time. And as we get closer to the start of a new swim season, hopefully things will be in a little bit better focus.
Yeah, Brian, just to add to that, right now there's, I've been aware of some teams that have come back with COVID, are now quarantined in a hotel at the cost of the organization. So lots of nuances with respect to travel in the current COVID environment. Another quick story to share. Client sent their national team to Buffalo, just crossed the border in Ontario to do a practice down in the States, and an athlete tore their ACL. And the cost to the athlete for medical care was over $100,000. And that athlete then looked at its national sport organization and said, hey, you took me as a national team member to the States. Well, what insurance do you have to pay for this bill? And the answer was they had none. And the NSO ended up paying out of its budget $100,000 for medical fees in Buffalo for a day trip. So to your point, Brian and Darren, to have adequate insurance, we recognize insurance is good for those catastrophic issues, those 1%, but they are massive. So if you are looking to travel in the next couple of years, please do your homework. And again, reach out to Darren and Brian and myself, and we can hopefully point you in the right direction, or at least educate you on the risks of going to training camp, which of course I still remember very fondly in my swimming days as probably one of the couple highlights of my career, was hanging out in Barbados for a couple of weeks with your swimming buddies. Was nothing quite like it. So I appreciate that. Any other questions on insurance, returning in a COVID environment? We've gone through the questions that came in advance. We've gone through the ones that are listed in the chat box. Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we can give you your Tuesday night back.
Steve, there's one here. I don't know if we might have answered it, but it's moving forward. What is the projected implication of vaccination to the potential of claims? I think you already answered that by.
Yeah, I think I answered it, Darren. I think again, as we see what happens from a government perspective, will dictate what we can and cannot mandate. And people choose not to be vaccinated, we'd have to deal with those cases on a case-by-case basis. Please do not make the decision of just simply saying no right away. I actually have a case ongoing right now where a club banned an athlete because they refused to wear a mask, and we are now on the appeal level of this complaint. So it's a lot of work to come with these decisions. So let's make sure that they are well informed. And again, from a litigation perspective, if a family chooses not to vaccinate, it could be used as a mechanism of defense or a contributory negligence claim back on the family, rather than suggesting the club or Swim Ontario is 100% responsible. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
I think before we go, I'd just like to reiterate the importance of contacting me if the club is at all threatened, or if there's a serious injury that we need to know about it as quickly as you do. And so my my email is on the Swim Ontario website. It's Darin, DARIN, at swimontario.com. I answer that about 17 hours a day. So you will not be disturbing me if you send an email in the evening, or even if you send an email in the middle of the night, it will get answered the next morning. So communication is really, really important with these types of situations.
You know, to reiterate on top of that, Darren, I call it a 90-10 rule. So if you're proactive on your decision making, it may cost you 10% of money or 10% of your time. But if we are reactive or make a quick judgment or a bad judgment call, it's likely going to occupy 90% of our time, or 90% of the value of the monetary side of it. So yeah, please, if you ever come across something, let Darren or Brian know, and we'll all assist you to make sure you have at least the best possible answer. A question just came in that if a swimmer does not follow our protocols, can we not allow them to train for the day? I would say the answer to that is absolutely yes, with the caveat that you're not making decisions or rules or protocols that are in breach of the Human Rights Code. Are we making decisions based on a prohibited ground? If the answer is no, and an athlete fails to respect the 6 feet social distancing protocols, or is constantly not abiding by your commands for safety, then absolutely, I'd say you'd have the right to remove them for the day. Brian, did you want to add to that? You sometimes get involved in these
Well,
issues.
and that's probably why I don't want to add to that, but in case I have to administer one of these complaints. I'll just leave it in a general sense. If your protocols are appropriate, then you have absolutely every right to ensure that people are complying with them and take whatever action you think is necessary in the circumstances. My only cautionary tale is, you're not going to allow them to train, that's fine, but you're not going to leave somebody on their own, a 10-year-old on their own. Sorry, you can't come in because you're going to do this. Go and stand in the parking lot for a few hours. Not really a recommended course of action either. But yes, generally speaking, you can control the environment, providing you have reasonable protocols and requirements in place.
Is it possible to share confidentially and withholding identifying features, examples of insurance and regulatory assistance with the impacted clubs from a legal perspective, so clubs can know better to prepare? Darren or Brian, is that?
I mean, I think we can give them some examples of that. So that's a question we can absolutely answer in writing. And I think the three of us on this call actually were involved in a circumstance where, you excluded a swimmer from participation because of some difficulties, and that would have been a decision of the club, which certainly impacted from a legal perspective, and I think was a know better or do better moment.
Yeah, I'd agree generically, Brian, that a lot of the issues that have come across all of our desks really relate to, mostly, I would say, a lot of human rights issues, making decisions that are protected by particular grounds. So I think that's something that's of concern. It's a lot of them are more on decisions than necessarily those slip and fall claims. Some of you might be familiar with the case out in Saskatchewan. I believe it was Saskatchewan, with respect to the depth of pools and blocks. That might be something we'd see more on the general liability side. But I'd say majority of legal issues that I get involved with particularly relate to decisions and what those decisions relate to.
And just sort of to square the circle in this, I think Kelly's also asking, regulatory decision that's made by some administrative body, which then impacts the club. Well, CRA would be the best example, and we can certainly provide you some examples of decisions which critically and negatively impact clubs as a result of not properly classifying a coach as an employee as opposed to an independent contractor being but one good example.
Okay, I feel like an auctioneer. Any last bids? Any last questions? If there's anything that you feel uncomfortable asking in a public setting or typing into a chat box, again, by all means, please follow up with Brian, Darren, myself, or Dean anytime. We'll find some time to make sure your queries are answered. And like I said, if this is not a comfortable environment, just pop us an email. We'll work through it. So with that being said, Darren, I'll let you say, or Dean, say the last words. But again, thank you everybody for listening to me. I appreciate it, and of course have a very soft spot for the swimming community. And keep doing what you're doing.
I don't know, Dean, do you have any final thoughts?
All yours. No, I think it's really informative as always, and I agree that if there's more questions, please take them offline and get your concerns alleviated. So thanks very much, Steve. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Darren and Brian, for the preparation and work you've put into this webinar and all the other things that you do. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Night.